Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery's Heritage Manager.
My name is Laura Burgess and I am a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm also a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as V. So my V is virginity. When we are talking about virginity in history, we're pretty much always talking about women's virginity. There's very little that's been recorded or written about the virginity of men. You can probably already picture in your head some famous virgins from history. Probably the number one slot goes to the Virgin Mary. I'm putting in second place Queen Elizabeth I, who was known as the Virgin Queen. And my number three, we might be getting into contentious territory, is the French Saint Joan of Arc. But there are also famous virgins who weren't actually even virgins. So you've got the Vestal Virgins, who could have been virgins, but not necessarily. And this was a group of well-respected and very strictly celibate priestesses in ancient Rome. And they were known, as I say, as the Vestal Virgins. And they were keepers of a sacred fire. So this fire had to be continually burning. And their chastity was linked to the security of the Roman state. So the idea was, if they lapsed in their chastity, or they let the fire go out, then the potential repercussions were huge for them as individuals, but also for Rome. But the reason why they weren't necessarily virgins, in spite of the name, is they were required to be entirely chaste while they held that position, but they were not required to have been before they took up that job. So that doesn't actually necessarily mean that they had never had sex. So there are, of course, lots of reasons why virginity was sort of venerated or respected. There's all sorts of elements that come back to baseline controlling women. But one of those was definitely that it made men feel more secure that their children, and especially their sons, were biologically theirs. The idea of your inheritance, the idea of your lineage being more secure if you married a woman who was a virgin. And the expectations on women to be virgins was very significant. And so you get a lot of medieval, particularly, recipes that contain treatments to help women appear to be virgins. So in amongst a medical recipe book that might contain treatments for fevers and broken legs and rashes and things like that, you also get recipes that show women how to recreate virginity. So I've written down a couple of examples here. So take the whites of eggs, mix them with water in which pennyroyal, which is a plant, and hot herbs have been cooked, with a new linen cloth dipped in it, place it in the vagina 3 times a day. So it is literally creating like a barrier, like a kind of false hymen by doing that. Take the newly grown bark of an oak and dissolve it with rainwater, with linen cloth, place it inside the vagina. Then, and this is the real kicker, let her place leeches in the vagina so that the blood comes out and thus man will be deceived.
No, thank you. The Vestal Virgins, were they always young women?
They were typically young women. They were a human embodiment of the Roman state. And so their youth and their beauty was part of that. You know, Rome is strong, Rome is beautiful, Rome is young. I found another text that described a treatment which would contract the parts to, quote, make a whore feel a virgin again.
Oh,
I mean, slightly loaded. There's quite a lot which hopefully you might find less awful, Olivia. There's quite a lot that recommended using animal blood. So at least it's not, like with the leech, making you bleed.
In some of the period dramas, there's that kind of idea that after a wedding night, you display the bedsheets as evidence of virginity. If there's blood on the bedsheets, all is okay. And in my mind, I would have thought the deception would be external, like you could fake the blood on the bedsheets. But it's interesting that there is actually, oh no, you've got to deceive the person that you're marrying also.
Yes, it's not just for the people outside the room. And I think a lot of the time they did understand that not every virgin had a hymen. You know, there wouldn't be blood necessarily. But the problem was that while lack of a hymen didn't prove that you weren't a virgin, having a hymen proved that you were. And so it was a shorthand that was really useful to then be able to, as you say, Olivia, you know, show the husband, but also show kind of people in the community. We don't really know how often this was actually done, but what we do know is we're not just talking about one recipe. We're talking about lots of recipes in lots of different places. So it was obviously something that was in people's consciousness and that people were concerned about and people were, to some extent, doing. Now, there are other ways, allegedly, of checking to see if a woman was a virgin. Because there were certain things that women, when they were virgins, could do that nobody else could do. Number one was they could attract and capture unicorns. Only virgins can do that. Another thing that virgins could do was that they could control hives of bees. Slightly more feasible to test, but, you know. And the final one was that virgins could restrain the urge to urinate. And I feel like that's a massive drop-off. We've gone from unicorns to bees to urinating. It feels like that's a bit less impressive. And I think the reason they included that last one was because that was more easy to test than the unicorn thing. So it was a known test that was actually done, is that you would, you know, get a woman, you would give her a jug of water to drink, and then you would time how long it took before she needed to go to the loo. And that would apparently show you whether she was actually a virgin or not. They did not articulate the science behind that.
I was going to say, did they let the woman know they were testing that, or was it just, have this glass of water and we'll just be over here?
I mean, I assume that she would have known if it was a standard thing, but
yeah,
it feels like they've got somehow confused with the biology if they think retaining water is anything to do with being a virgin.
I guess it's a slightly more kind test than maybe having a bunch of bees dumped over your head.
Yes. It feels like an unfair test, but it doesn't feel like a violent or horrendous test, certainly. In the medieval world, you never know where things can go, so actually that seems pretty chilled.
I'm just so interested about the unicorn. Where did that come from? The idea of someone being like, yeah, you can tell who a virgin is if they've got unicorns hanging around is honestly the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life.
It was part of the mythology around unicorns that if you wanted to trap a unicorn, which you might want to do because they were useful for various different things. Disclaimer, I'm not suggesting that unicorns are real, but one of the guides in how to trap a unicorn was to take a virgin and get her to sort of stand by a lake or something, and then the unicorns would come to her. So I don't know where that mythology came from, but it gets repeated quite a lot, and you can see it in some of the early images and things.
I just love how much unicorns seem to come up in this podcast series, because I feel like we have referenced unicorn horns before. I just like that they just seem to keep making a comeback, and I love that.
The duality of woman is that it's very, very important to be a virgin until it's very, very important that you are no longer a virgin. And this is because virginity can make you sick, according to these stories.
It reminds me of the episode on H about hysteria. One of the suggested prescriptions was marriage, you know, to settle the womb.
In terms of male virginity, do you know of any cases where the prescription was, yeah, you're not doing so well, maybe you should get married?
No, because men didn't have to get married in order to lose their virginity.
Good point, yep. Oh, society.
That sounds like a really good ending to this section. Oh, society. Laura, what's your V?
My V is vampirism. I'm actually going to be looking at what inspired vampires. And there's many that believe that it was inspired by a few medical ailments. So I'm going to go from least likely, I think, to most likely. So the first one that's kind of connected with vampires is tuberculosis, also known as consumption, TB. Rhode Island was once considered the vampire capital of America. So between the late 1700s and 1890s, the vampire superstitions and them being considered real was quite prevalent in New England due to the fact that there was an outbreak of TB. It wasn't a big stretch for people to connect tuberculosis to vampirism due to the symptoms. So people who suffered from untreated tuberculosis lost weight rapidly, became physically weak, fevers, coughing up blood, and it also spread from person to person through the air. So it was a very rapid infection rate. So there was this infamous incident of Mercy Brown in Exeter, Rhode Island. She died of tuberculosis in 1892. So less than 2 months after Mercy died, the people of Exeter exhumed her body, as well as those of her mother and sister, who'd also died of TB. Because so many people in the same family died of the disease, they assumed that there was a vampire at play that was victimizing this one family. When they found that Mercy's body was the least decomposed, they believed her to be the vampire. So what they did was they removed her heart, they burned it, and then they fed the ashes to her brother as a way of stopping the curse. Not surprisingly, he still died of TB. Moving on from TB, the other disease is rabies. Given that rabies is contracted by wild animals, you'd kind of expect it more to be connected with werewolves. But however, there is a 1998 paper in Neurology by Juan Gomez Alonso put forth a convincing series of arguments that put the symptoms of rabies front and centre in many vampire tales. So rabies is caused by rabies laccivirus, and I might be pronouncing that incorrectly. If I do, I apologise. And the virus usually infects the central nervous system, ultimately reaching the brain, and that causes a lot of symptoms, kind of starting quite early with like anxiety, confusion, agitation, insomnia, and then it kind of moves on to hallucinations and abnormal, usually violent behaviour, before ultimately killing the infected person. There's the idea of rabies being transmitted from blood to blood that has connections to vampires. Yeah, and also the fact that there's the bodies of people who suffered from rabies have things like hemorrhaging, blood kind of foaming from their mouths. Awful, which again has that connection.
One of the features of rabies is that it takes such a strangely long time to appear. So typically you only develop your symptoms a couple of months after having been bitten. It's a really long time. So people were kind of looking around for a cause and they didn't always make the connection. So I wonder if that helps.
Yeah, I guess it would help. And I just find it fascinating because, as I said earlier, like you'd think if you were going to connect a lot of these supernatural creatures to medical, I guess, ailments, I wouldn't usually pair vampires with rabies in my head now. I would pair it more with werewolves and the whole bite. And also the fact that it is usually would kill you as well. Apparently the most interesting point that kind of makes a connection between rabies and vampirism is that during the period when dramatic tales of vampires were first emerging from Eastern Europe, a major epidemic of rabies in dogs, wolves, and other wild animals was recorded in the same region between 1721 and 1728. So maybe there's this unconscious connection that we can look back and see as maybe that's what influenced it, but maybe they themselves weren't really making those connections.
This is a real stretch, but another thought would be, one of the versions of vampirism has them afraid of holy water,
Yes.
like cowering from holy water. Well, rabies, you're afraid of water. You have, it's one of the symptoms is a complete fear of water.
The probably most common medical disorder connected to vampirism is porphyria. And I hope I'm saying that correctly because I want to say porphyria for some reason, but I literally looked it up and it's porphyria. So, probably one of the most famous cases was to George III, and his madness is considered to be caused by porphyria. So, porphyria is a group of red blood disorders that result from a buildup of natural chemicals called porphyrins. Porphyrins are needed to make heme, a part of hemoglobin, protein in the red blood cells that carries oxygen around the body. So it's also considered inherited, and sometimes even referred to as the vampire disease. Some of the symptoms that are connected, so there's apparently extreme sensitivity to sunlight leading to facial disfigurement, blackened skin and hair growth, fangs, which I was shocked to find out. In addition to facial disfigurement, so there's repeated attacks of the disease causes the gums to recede, exposing the teeth, which some might think look like fangs. Blood drinking, but because the urine of the person affected is more of a red-brown, there's folklore that believed that was caused by drinking blood. And in fact, some physicians had recommended these patients drink blood to compensate for the defect in their red blood cells. But this recommendation was animal blood, not human blood. Aversion to garlic, which apparently was the sulfur content of garlic, would lead to an attack of porphyria, leading to very acute pain. And fear of the crucifix, again tying into rabies and the fear of maybe water and then holy water. So apparently during the Spanish Inquisition, 600 vampires, and for the people listening, obviously everyone, that's in quotations, were reportedly burned at the stake. But some of them were just sufferers from porphyria, and therefore porphyria patients were valid in their fear of Christianity because it was used against them. Also, porphyria was a disorder that was quite prevalent amongst the upper classes in Eastern Europe. So I think that also kind of ties into this character of the vampire from Bram Stoker. I'm going to end my little segment with an interesting fact. There's a Scottish vampire, the Bavanshi, apparently a very sinister creature in fairy folklore that lurks around the Scottish Highlands and drawn to hunters by the smell of blood. The Bavanshi can read a man's mind and shapeshift into their greatest desire in order to lure him in to then drain him of his blood. And usually she's kind of portrayed as wearing a long green dress in order to cover and conceal her goat or deer legs, which kind of is an identifying factor to say that she's not human. But yeah, so I found that quite interesting in my study of vampires, that they're a Scottish vampire.
I suppose in a way that makes it tricky to find a disease that's a source, because it's almost like there's so many different vampire type figures in so many different cultures. There's an Irish vampire and there's a Scottish vampire and there's a Romanian vampire and there's a Russian vampire. You know, in mythology, it's almost like humans have independently from each other created the concept of a blood-sucking human-shaped creature, you know?
I think there's a lot of, when you talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, there's wide speculation that it was inspired by Vlad the Impaler. But it is interesting to see that this kind of trope sometimes is adapted slightly to the needs of, I guess, the community.
So what's your V then, Olivia?
So I've gone for a word that I hope doesn't give anyone flashbacks. Vaccine. It does relate to recent time, I suppose, but the idea of getting vaccinated for both your own health and the health of others is a very old concept. I'm going to start this with some etymology because I love to do that. The word vaccine and vaccination comes from the cowpox virus, vaccinia, which comes from the Latin word for cow, vacca. The Oxford English Dictionary credits French authors for coining the term vaccine in 1800 and vaccination in 1803, but other sources claim that the term was used as an adjective in 1799 by the British general practitioner Dr. Edward Jenner, and the noun vaccination being introduced by his friend Richard Dunning in 1800. But that aside, all discussion about vaccination usually centres on Edward Jenner and smallpox. He was an English surgeon who trained at St George's Hospital in London as a student of John Hunter and received his MD in 1792 from the University of St Andrews, later becoming a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. Huzzah! Jenner observed that milkmaids infected with cowpox, which manifests itself as a series of pustules on the hands and forearms, those milkmaids were immune to the smallpox epidemics that were regularly occurring in his parish. He made his first vaccination in 1796, taking pus from the cowpox lesion on the hand of a milkmaid, Sarah Nelms, and introducing that fluid into a cut he'd made in the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. 6 weeks later, Jenner exposed the boy to smallpox, but he didn't develop the infection either then or on the 20 subsequent exposures to the disease. Phipps later married, had 2 children, and lived long enough to attend Jenner's funeral. Between 1796 and 1798, Jenner collected 23 cases of people inoculated with the cowpox virus, and in his subsequent report concluded that the cowpox protects the human constitution from the infection of smallpox. It was a groundbreaking conclusion that kind of set the wheels in motion for fields of immunology, public health, and preventative health. But there was also opposition to the smallpox vaccine. When Jenner published his report, he faced criticism because he couldn't explain how the vaccination worked. This was prior to Louis Pasteur's discovery of germ theory in 1853. Some people didn't like the idea that using a disease from cows and believed that people might grow horns. And some members of the church believed that because the disease was sent by God, the vaccine interfered with God's will. So because of those general reasons, the Royal Society refused to publish Jenner's ideas. There was a long history of people being immunized against smallpox by variolation, which is the controlled transfer of pus from one person's active smallpox to another person's arm. That infection, because it's on the skin, usually led to a milder localized infection, but it still induced immunity to the virus. But Jenner's newer method of immunizing with the cowpox virus was not only effective, but it had fewer side effects, was much safer for those people that had been vaccinated, and was far more rarely transmitted to their contacts. So the collateral smallpox cases spread by variolated subjects shortly after variolation outweighed the benefits of the procedure. Cowpox served as a natural vaccine until the modern smallpox vaccine emerged in the 20th century. And by 1980, the World Health Organization announced that smallpox had been completely wiped out. The subsequent years of vaccination post Jenner's discovery in Scotland are quite interesting. So one of the first public vaccination centres for smallpox in the UK was established at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow in 1801. That college was the only professional medical body to deliver a public vaccination programme. 2 members of the college administered vaccines every Monday from 12 to 1, with the poor vaccinated for free. And in the first 5 years of the programme, approximately 10,000 people were vaccinated, and the college continued the service until 1896, which is wild. That it went so quickly from Jenner's discovery to public vaccination programme. I mean, we did do that with the COVID vaccine. That moved very quickly because it was necessary. But the discovery of vaccination was picked up very quickly. People saw the benefit of it very early. So the eventual acceptance of the smallpox vaccine led to a fall in deaths, but it wasn't until 1863 that Scotland finally got a Vaccination Act, which introduced compulsory vaccination against smallpox. The Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh and other medical bodies in Scotland successfully lobbied to detach vaccination from poor law, which is how the Act was administered in England. And although the parish authorities paid doctors to vaccinate the very poor, parents could go to any doctor of their choice and were charged a small fee for vaccination. There were always people who refused vaccination, be it due to the concern over side effects or for religious principles. As in England, there was a fine for Scottish parents who failed to have their children vaccinated. Doctors could postpone vaccinating a sick baby, but only for 2 months at a time, and had to pursue the matter until the child was vaccinated. Scottish registrars followed up with parents who didn't vaccinate their children, and if a father persistently refused vaccination in spite of warnings from the registrar, he could receive regular fines of £1 at a time, or if he couldn't pay, 10 days in prison. In 1907, the law was amended to permit conscientious objection to vaccination at a time where the threat from smallpox had diminished. If the father affirmed before a magistrate that he objected to vaccination because he believed it threatened the health of his child and paid a fee, he would receive a certificate to take to the registrar, and vaccination was not enforced. Interesting or not interesting? I can't tell from your reactions.
I was thinking, which is unhelpful on a podcast, why that shift happened, why they decided that it would no longer be compulsory at a time when, as you say, it might have diminished, but it was still, the threat was still there. It's like, oh, it's interesting. Is that a political shift?
I think so. There were anti-vaccination lobbyists even then.
It's easier to treat something like this sort of as a sort of political point if the actual threat is much smaller, like the actual threat to life is much smaller, then it can become political rather than literally being just a life or death question.
There was concern for the social welfare aspect of vaccination programs from the mid-1800s. I've got an example from the Remote and Rural Remedies Project, the Highlands and Islands surveys, which there will be a link in the description. I don't know if you want to briefly mention the background to that project, Daisy, because my mind's gone blank.
No, so we carried out a digitisation and transcription project, which is all now online and fully indexed and searchable, of some surveys that were carried out by our college in the 1850s. And that was a real point where in the Highlands and Islands there were all sorts of issues around poor law and poverty and lack of access to medicine. So it was a survey of what medical treatment was available in the Highlands and Islands in the 1850s.
Thank you. So I did look at the records available on the Remote and Rural Remedies website. They mention tours undertaken by practitioners specifically for the purpose of delivering vaccines, but the quote I'm going to give is from a survey by Robert Clark Harris near Lochmaddy in 1851. He says, "Vaccination is a thing not much attended to in the Western Islands because the people cannot afford to pay for it. Neither can a medical practitioner afford to travel over a score of miles of rugged, broken moor and morass to vaccinate for nothing. Although I have a right to charge for vaccination, operations and medicines, such charges cannot be realised. The government ought to take vaccination under its charge in these remote quarters and pay for it. It would encourage the people to seek employment south, whereas at present the dread of smallpox prevents them in great measure. It would tend much to improve their social condition." So I think there was a feeling that part of the reason that some people stayed in the Highlands and Islands and didn't move was because they feared smallpox infection if they travelled to the cities. And it was a legitimate fear because there were cases of people travelling for work in the lowlands and then returning and infecting wildly populations with smallpox.
I think it was a real problem, I think even before vaccination, when they were using the other system that you talked about, Olivia, variolation, in rural places, because if you were in a city, there was always some smallpox around. It might not be on your street or in your area, but it was there and you were aware of it. Whereas rural places, it tended to sort of come in waves every few years. So people would go, there's no need to vaccinate or variolate. We haven't had smallpox in this village, in this remote village, for like 20 years. So the rates dropped off. Then a huge number of people became infected, lots of people died, and everyone frantically vaccinated or variolated, depending on the time. But then, because no smallpox appeared, people stopped doing it. They forgot about it, and then, and then the rates went down. So it tended to come in these really devastating cycles because people lost interest in vaccination because they thought, it's not happened here in decades. Like, there's not even been a case here. It was a real problem in remote areas that people didn't get it done because they thought there was no risk, and then there was a risk, and then it all went horribly wrong. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.